Whether you're a ghoul, a zombie, a werewolf, or God forbid, a Nazi vampire, nothing can put the fear of said god in you quite like the name Helsing. The Royal Order of Protestant Knights, as it is formally known, was created with the intent to protect Her Majesty's Great Britain from supernatural threats that the general populace doesn't quite believe exist in the first place. For over a century, Helsing has been fighting against the occult and evil within the territory of that once great empire. And the irony is that their trump card, their ace in the hole, is an inhuman himself. Alucard, the original vampire, is the primary cleaner of this supernatural trash disposal unit. But Helsing is more than a one-man show. In the Hellsing manga and OVA series, and especially in the Hellsing 2001 series, the Hellsing organization plays a much larger role than simply being the framework within which Alucard can play. And we're here to break it all down for you guys. So strap on hats and grab your castles. This is the Hellsing organization's origins explored. It was a one-man show in its initial days. Kind of. The Hellsing organization's roots and how it was founded. The roots of the Hellsing organization lie within another great piece of vampire fiction, Bram Stoker's Dracula. Kota Hirano decided to base his series on the same Count Dracula that once fought Dr. Abraham Van Helsing and just tweak the details here and there to fit his own narrative, which worked out well for him because he was able to create the Hellsing organization out of it. In Bram Stoker's original work, Dracula is put down by Abraham Van Helsing with a wooden stake. Yes, we heard you and thanks for correcting us, marvelous viewers, but in Hirano's Hellsing, the Count isn't quite killed off by his mortal enemy. During the course of his journey across Transylvania and his entire association with Count Dracula, Dr. Abraham Van Helsing had come to realize that even with his many degrees in things both scientific and mystic, when it comes to the occult, the best way to win was to fight fire with fire. So instead of finishing off Dracula as he did in Bram Stoker's work, Abraham Van Helsing took the Count back to England with him. He set him up in his lavish manner and experimented on him with his extensive occult knowledge to simultaneously restrict and augment his powers. When Abraham Van Helsing fought the Count, holy objects and things like garlic were practically anthrax for the man. Now he was able to resist decapitation with a bayonet imbued with scriptural powers for the specific purpose of killing inhumans like him. His hold over his familiars became restrained with the control art restriction system to ensure that Alucard didn't go berserk mid-battle without explicitly being asked to do so. Because now that all of the regular flaws of a vampire's existence had been removed, he was practically indestructible. Abraham Van Helsing must have also sealed the deal with some sort of blood pact with the Nosferatu, because it is repeatedly stated thereafter that the only people who could truly call themselves Alucard's masters were the appointed heads of the Helsing family, because only they could reap the fruits of the Helsing's family's labors, which had turned Alucard into the ultimate undead weapon against the undead themselves. At some point, Abraham must have introduced his new servant/weapon to the Queen, because in the Hellsing OVA series and the manga, we learn that the Queen and Alucard have known each other for a while and are actually quite fond of each other. If you're asking why Abraham would need to make that introduction though, well, the reason is quite simple. Just look at Helsing's formal name, the Royal Order of Protestant Knights. Now, we're no political experts, but we're pretty sure that in Hirano's world, an organization like that can only come into existence with the explicit permission of the Queen herself, who seems to be more than just a political figurehead. That and the civilian government would need to be notified of this new top-secret order in order to help them function as smoothly and discreetly as possible. Because while fighting undead creatures was ultimately for the good of Britain, the British people themselves might not really understand or even bother to care about such an important mission. The existence of the undead is essentially unnatural because it goes against all the laws of God, and so eliminating them wasn't just a tactical move, it was also a deeply religious one. In Bram Stoker's original work, Van Helsing was raised as a Dutch Catholic, but in Hirano's Hellsing, he ends up as the leader of the Royal Order of Protestant Knights, which is also the formal name for Helsing. It's dramatic irony considering that the Catholic Church, specifically the Vatican itself, ends up becoming sworn enemies of Helsing simply because they adhere to the Protestant faith. Well, that and also they were intruding on Vatican jurisdiction by attempting to fight supernatural creatures just like them, though in Helsing's defense, their area of operations was limited to Great Britain and the United Kingdom itself. Helsing was formed as a defensive force, unlike the Vatican's Iscari, which acts more as an assault force, especially in the hands of Enrico Maxwell. We say Helsing's mission was more deeply religious because of their motto. The official Helsing motto is, "We will not give up in despair, we are on a mission from God," with the latter half appearing on their quartered organizational crest alongside the image of a tower, which symbolizes strength. In the 2001 anime, this mission becomes even more overt, as the Helsing organization seems to have a small prayer that they chant before operatives are sent off on a mission, which goes something like, "In the name of God, impure souls of the living dead shall be banished into eternal damnation. Amen." This phrase doesn't appear in the original manga, but it suits the organization's overall aesthetic as this religious military wing that is dedicated to ridding Her Majesty's territories of evil creatures. But that's all we have for you on the founding of Helsing. Let's move on to something a little less exciting for some of you, but perhaps more exciting for the rest: bureaucracy. Helsing's organization. Command structure, resources, and operational authority. The Royal Order of Protestant Knights is an order whose leadership appears to be hierarchical. That's because only a member of the Helsing family can control Alucard, and considering that having a person who cannot even control the trump card of the organization at the helm would be disastrous, this distinction only makes sense to us. The first leader of the organization was, of course, Dr. Abraham van Helsing, who was knighted upon the creation of the order, thus becoming Sir Abraham van Helsing, the first leader of the Helsing organization. Abraham worked closely with key members of the British Parliament, military, and the Queen herself to create a command system that ensured Helsing would remain on top of things at all times, whilst keeping the wider civilian population and military command systems in the total dark about their very existence. This was altered in the 2001 anime, where Helsing's existence was known by some authoritative organizations, like the D11 unit for example, but the general population was still kept in the dark overall. In order to make deployment and information exchange as efficient as possible, a convention of 12 members was set up, with 11 members being high-ranking officials in British politics and military, and the 12th being the director of Helsing. The council only meets on rare occasions, and the Queen's appearance at such meetings is even rarer, but it is this round table that keeps British citizens safe from every fantasy beast that they can possibly have nightmares about. The Helsing organization gets its funding and intelligence from this convention, and this round table of elites is also responsible for ensuring that their activities remain a secret by controlling the flow of information as best they can. The Royal Order of Protestant Knights used the luxurious Victorian-style manor of the Helsing family as its base of operations, and despite having the world's strongest undead on their side, they did need other field operatives to cover the sheer scope of supernatural activity in Great Britain. This is where the Helsing organization's special military forces come into play. Their role was minimized to being glorified bodyguards and fodder in the original manga and the OVA series, but in the 2001 Helsing anime, they were treated like a proper Black Ops paramilitary unit. Kota Hirano's original version had only about 100 people in the entire Helsing organization, including its top brass, Ace in the Hole, and family butler, which ends up getting reduced to a tenth of its size thanks to Luke and Jan Valentine. In Helsing 2001, the Special Military Forces is nearly 200 strong, well-equipped, and well-trained in supernatural combat, to the point that they even carry out strike missions without needing Alucard's help. In the OVA, Helsing soldiers were equipped with a red beanie bearing the Helsing emblem, a black vest, a green military shirt, green trousers, and combat boots, which is pretty standard gear if you ask us. For weapons, they use the Heckler & Koch MP5K PDW submachine gun and Colt Model 733 assault rifle for their main weapon, with the Beretta 92 FS acting as their secondary weapon. The Beretta and the MP5K come with 9mm rounds, which, while standard issue, are basically useless against opponents that are undead unless used at point-blank range. The Colt 733 is a better option considering its faster velocity, but its loadup was specifically designed to be less lethal than the ammo used in previous AR models. In the 2001 anime, things are different because Helsing packs the appropriate firepower for vampire hunting. Their gear remains pretty much the same, with the addition of a headset for field operatives who needed the guidance of their acting commanders. Their weapons were entirely different, as the Glock is pretty much the only weapon they use with 9mm bullets. The Helsing Special Military Forces rely on heavy firepower with submachine guns like the MP5A3 and assault rifles like the Colt M16A1 and Enfield L85, both of which give them an edge in battle with their 5.56mm caliber ammo. Helsing also makes extensive use of anti-riot weapons like the R-Win-37 grenade launcher, which is primarily created to disperse mild chemical irritants, smoke/tear gas, or shoot projectiles that cause blunt force trauma to the target. For long-range purposes, the Special Military Forces use the Accuracy International Arctic Warfare Sniper Rifle, which is mainly handled by Captain Gareth Stedler or Saris Victoria, but the latter doesn't usually use a scope because her Draculina eyes can see better without it. For transportation, they utilize the typical unmarked white vans that have become a staple of secret organizations in popular fiction, as well as the odd helicopter when the occasion calls for it. The Special Military Forces usually train at Helsing Manor itself, which has a dedicated training range for them, and after the Valentine brothers' assault, when Helsing needed to replenish their depleted forces, they conducted recruitment drills on the manor grounds in a makeshift test platform that was also likely used for practice by the Special Forces when they weren't on call. All of this was funded by the Crown, of course, and the Special Forces were under the capable eye of Helsing Commander Peter Ferguson, but the final authorization for the actions of Helsing didn't exactly always come from the Queen. The director of Helsing, who was also the head of the Helsing family, was usually the one sitting at the head of the table and calling all the shots. The Queen would only involve herself when something world-ending was about to occur, like a terrorist plot to blow up the Tower of London, or the return of Nazis to this time as artificial vampire. The bulk of the work is left up to the soldiers of Helsing, who use the Helsing family's extensive occult research to their own advantage, developing weapons capable of taking out inhuman enemies and carrying out their missions with the utmost conviction. Most of this is never shown in Helsing Ultimate, which is why we kind of prefer Helsing 2001 personally, because that show just has so much life to it. After the Valentine brothers attack Helsing Manor in Helsing Ultimate and the manga, their fallen soldiers are simply replaced by Pip Bernadotte's wild geese mercenary force. And you guys don't need us to tell you about the black reputation of mercs, despite how chill Pip himself actually was. But that's enough about the boring technical stuff. Let's get to the real reason you all came here today. 3 generations, 2 vampires, and 1 treacherous butler. Helsing's most important historical and contemporary figures. We've already mentioned Sir Abraham van Helsing, who, as the founder of the organization, has already cemented his status as a legendary figure in the Helsing universe. His first known successor to the title of director was his descendant Arthur, who was acting as the head of Helsing during the Second World War. It's safe to assume that Arthur was either Abraham's son or someone in the generation after him, because there's at least 45 years between the latter taking down Alucard and the former deploying him to Warsaw during World War II. As a person, Arthur was unlike his predecessor in all the wrong ways. He was a womanizer who loved to drink and literally behaved like the mouse that would come out to play when his disciplined cat Walter was away. But when it came down to business, Arthur was as cunning as he was ruthless. And perhaps that is part of the reason why Walter ends up betraying Helsing towards the end of the century. In Helsing, The Dawn, we learn that Arthur deployed a 14-year-old Walter to the proverbial heart of Helsing's greatest enemies at the time, Millennium. British intelligence had learned that Hitler was rapidly building an occult force of some sort, and that if it were to be unleashed, that it would mean certain disaster for the Allied forces stuck in Dunkirk. Arthur dispatched Walter to make sure that those boys came home, and while he was supremely confident in his Angel of Death butler's capabilities of wiping out those krauts with little to no effort, that is not what ended up happening. Instead, Walter got his butt handed to him by the werewolf captain and had to be bailed out of certain death by Alucard, who proceeded to dismiss the entire situation and force Walter to deal with the captain on his own while he went and messed around with Rip Van Winkle. This incident ended up fostering resentment towards Alucard and Helsing in general in Walter's heart, so he became Millennium's double agent and stayed with Helsing whilst giving his new masters all the scoops about their latest movements. But this also brings us to the most recognizable face of the Helsing organization in the entire franchise, Sir Integra Fairbrook Wingates Helsing. Integra became the head of Helsing when her father's brother Richard tried to usurp the directorship of Helsing for himself by killing her off, as Arthur had named her his official successor. The Convention of 12 had alerted Walter of this plot in the hope that he would protect Integra, but on that fateful night, Walter was nowhere to be found. It was bitter irony for the Angel of Death that the very thing that kept his mistress alive was the thing he hated the most, because Integra ended up waking Alucard from his death sleep in order to protect herself. At first, Alucard was about to refuse her orders, but when she stood her ground as the director and family head of Helsing, Alucard accepted Integra as his master and slaughtered her uncle without hesitation for being a coward that couldn't even stand up to a child. From that point onward, he remained loyal to Integra, with Alucard even offering her the chance to become a vampire herself on at least 2 occasions. But by the time the main storyline of Helsing begins, he isn't the only vampire in the game anymore. In the first chapter of Helsing, we meet the innocent police girl Ceres Victoria, who through no fault of her own ends up getting tangled up with the Cheddar Priest. At the brink of death, Ceres chooses life and accepts Alucard's offer of becoming a Draculina. And just like that, Helsing's supernatural ranks increase by a full 100%. Ceres' addition to the roster was a double-edged blade in the beginning. Although she was extremely strong and could use her strengths to sneak out the big W in most situations, her internal struggle at having lost her humanity and her unwillingness to take human lives as a consequence of it keep her from reaching her full potential. This struggle was explored more in depth in Hellsing 2001 than Hellsing Ultimate, in our opinion, but the end result of both was the same. Ceres ended up drinking blood eventually and becoming a full-fledged Draculina, which truly made her second only to Alucard in Hellsing. Up until that point, you could have argued that Walter owned that position, given the simple fact that when he saw undead zombies trying to attack and take over his house, he didn't hesitate to slice them into ribbons, even though they were supposedly on his side. And speaking of undead zombies, we think a good way to tie this whole operation together would be by talking about the 2 main threats that Helsing has to deal with in its lifetime. Apart from the random appearance of supernatural creatures that necessitates Helsing mobilizing itself, only 2 other names can cause them to spring into action without a second thought: Millennium and Iscariot. Millennium is the name of the occult division that was created as a result of Hitler's Special Orders 666. Headed by the SS veteran, the Major, the first time Helsing came into contact with Millennium was during World War II, as we've already mentioned earlier in the video. Back then, Alucard and Walter were able to clean up Warsaw's illegal human experimentation problem, but they failed to kill Millennium's top brass because they just escaped to Latin America and started their occult program all over again. About 50 years later, Millennium resurfaces by sending in artificial vampires to terrorize Europe as they plan a large-scale invasion of Britain, with London as ground zero. Though they were there to essentially wage an endless war, they didn't expect to find some old allies turned enemies on the field as well, who also happen to be the second arch-enemies of the Helsing organization. Vatican's Chapter 13, Iscariot, might have been active for far longer than Helsing as a paranormal line of defense, but its outright hatred for Protestants makes them no better than the Millennium guys, and the fanaticism displayed by Enrico Maxwell especially is particularly sickening. Guys like Paladin Alexander Anderson believe in their cause with an unwavering sense of faith that is fervent, yes, but not exploitative. You would find Anderson delighting in the accidental death of Protestants, but even he would bemoan the intentional killing of innocent people, be they Catholic or Protestant. That's exactly what he does during the Battle of London, where he ends up turning on his protege turned master Maxwell for betraying their commands from the Pope and ordering a complete purge of London instead. The climactic moment of the entire Battle of London comes when Alucard, having unleashed all his familiars, ends up absorbing the omnipresent Schrödinger and loses his sense of self as a consequence. Schrödinger's unique existence allowed him to be omnipresent as long as he was aware of himself, but when his blood was mixed with the blood of the people who had died in Millennium and Iscariot's assault on London, he forgot who he was, which subsequently made Alucard forget who he was and phase out of existence for 3 decades. In the aftermath, Helsing rebuilt without him, with Ceres as their new ace, and they themselves being in a far stronger position than ever before. With Millennium destroyed and Iscariot reduced to a shell of themselves, Helsing was practically unmatched with the Draculina Ceres Victoria and the Dame of Death Integra Helsing in charge of the show. And sadly, it appears that Helsing will only exist so long as the latter does. At the beginning of this video, we made it clear that Helsing is a hierarchical organization. The only way that it continues to exist is if there are heirs to assume the responsibility of directorship. Integra is the last living member of the Helsing family, and 30 years after losing Alucard, she is well beyond childbearing age. Even after he returns to her, having eliminated all his familiars and incorporating Schrodinger's unique existence into his own, there is no way for Integra to continue the Helsing line of blood unless she turns into a Draculina herself. The 2001 anime hinted that this is what ended up happening after Alucard defeated the show-exclusive villain Incognito, but the manga and OVA series ends without any such reference. Though Helsing as an organization continues to exist canonically, it is living on borrowed time, and only Kota Hirano knows when the Reaper will come to collect that particular debt. If we could have our way, he'd be phased out of existence just like Schrodinger, but hey, that's wishful thinking 101, isn't it? Marvelous verdict. But with that, we've arrived at the end of this video. The Helsing organization can often feel like a small task force comprised of just 2 vampires, Alfred on steroids, and the most badass female anime character of all time. But when you take a step away from the crazy action of the series, it shows you just how much depth it actually has. The origins of the Helsing organization and its continued existence are proof that the human will always triumph over any kind of evil or sin. And if you should take any lesson away from Hirano's bloody, gore-filled, frantically paced bestseller, it's that one. But until you need to start taking things seriously, you can join us in the Helsing discussion by letting us know what you think about this video in the comments section down below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one.